Yes.
Okay, now I'm moderate and I will talk in Chinese. So, 好，大家好，尊敬的 The channel is好，大家好，尊敬的克鲁格女士，尊敬的Pastor 先生以及各位领导、专家朋友们，大家下午好、晚上好以及早上好。这是一个全球的会议，感谢大家参加今天的论坛。考虑到今天除了 Zoom 会议的嘉宾以外，我们还有很多朋友通过国内在线的平台来给大家做参加我们这个活动。所以呢，我现在用的这个所有的这个流程的主持都用中文来主持。如果你需要用中文的同传，那么请你在屏幕下方的这个同传的功能的按钮上选择中文的频道。If you need Chinese to English interpretation, please select the English channel from the interpretation feature at the toolbar below. Thank you for your cooperation. And 直播平台中我们会做到实时的中文翻译，好吧？好，今天我们的这个论坛叫国际对话，全球气候变化的合作与治理。活动呢是由清华大学全球可持续发展研究院和清华大学产业发展与环境治理研究中心联合主办，由卡内基气候倡议治理倡议支持。今天请允许我来介绍一下今天论坛的发言的嘉宾，他们是政府间气候变化专门委员会副主席 Tsinghua University 女士IPCC 的这个副主席。第二是德国联邦环境局局长Dirk Massner 先生。塞内加尔环境与可持续发展部部长内阁主任Sheikh Nadiri Seri 先生，还有中国21世纪议程管理中心主任黄金先生，经济合作与发展组织环境总司司长朱Yerdal 女士，瑞士环境大使瑞士联邦环境办公室国际事务负责人Felix Wortley 先生，以及中国社会科学院可持续发展研究中心副主任研究员陈莹女士，以及我们的合作方卡内基气候治理倡议执行主任 Janos Pastor 先生。我们这边的主办方清华大学全球可持续发展研究院院长，清华大学产业发展与治理研究中心学术委员会联席主席，清华大学苏世民书院院长薛兰先生。我是今天活动的主持人，清华大学全球可持续发展研究院执行院长，清华大学公共管理学院院长朱旭峰。感谢3家机构以及各位专家对我们活动的支持，非常期待与各位专家的交流。根据政府间气候变化专门委员会 IPCC 最新发布的报告，我们知道，尽管世界各国在采取气候行动，但气候过冲的风险仍然持续升高。全球领导人应该采取积极措施来应对气候变化以及可能的气候过冲的挑战。在昨天的第3届“一带一路”国际合作高峰论坛上，各方领导人回顾联合国2030可持续发展议程、联合国气候变化框架公约以及巴黎协定气候 生物多样性公约以及昆明蒙特利尔生物多样性框架，支持共同推进建设丝绸之路，绿色丝绸之路，来实现人与自然和谐的共生。大会指出，我们应采取气候行动，应对气候变化，以遵循公平、共同但有区别的责任和各自能力的原则。在此背景下，我们急需共同发展相应的技术来应对气候变化，实现全球绿色转型和可持续发展。其中，诸如碳捕集、太阳辐射干预技术等新技术有望帮助我们更好的来实现绿色转型和可持续发展目标。在这里呢，我也简单的介绍一下太阳辐射干预技术 （Solar Radiation Modification） 这个样的技术。它是通过人为的改变地球系统的反照率，将太阳辐射反射回宇宙，以控制全球变暖。有专家认为，该项技术的应用将有可能解决全球变暖等问题。但现阶段，我们对该技术限制全球气候上升的效果，以及在实施过程中可能带来的附带的影响，仍然处于知识的空白。值得一提的是，我们今天的活动也是清华大学全球可持续发展研究院和卡内基气候治理倡议携手的一系列学术活动的一个总结。专家们在我们往期的活动中也开展了相关的学术的讨论。今天我们将基于这些讨论的成果，并邀请新嘉宾围绕这一议题开展相关的深入的探讨。好，那么我们这个下面呢，我们就进入自持环节。首先呢，我们有请清华大学全球可持续发展研究院院长、清华大学产业发展与环境治理研究中心学术委员会联席主席，清华大学苏世民书院院长薛兰教授来致辞。
尊敬的各位领导、专家、老师们、同学们、朋友们，大家早上好、下午好、晚上好。感谢各位百忙之中参加今天的论坛。我仅代表2家主办机构，欢迎各位的到来。本次论坛的主题聚焦气候变化的合作与治理。我们希望通过国际对话，推动多方合作，携手应对气候危机。近年来，气候变化所引发的全球和局部危机愈演愈烈，多区域并发极端天气气候事件和复合型事件的概率和频率大大增加。极端海平面和强降水叠加，造成复合型洪涝事件的危害加剧。全球变暖正在影响地球上每一个地区，其中许多变化不可逆转，温度升高、海平面上升、极端气候事件频发，给人类生存和发展带来严峻挑战，对全球粮食、水、生态、能源、基础设施以及民众生命财产安全构成长期重大威胁。根据政府间气候变化专门委员会 IPCC 发布的最新报告指出，尽管全球各国正在加大气候行动力度，但超出原先在巴黎协定上所提出的 1.5 到 2.0 摄氏度温控目标的概率越来越大，这将给人类和生态系统带来重大风险，应对气候变化刻不容缓。同时，随着2030年可持续发展议程已过半程，在9月刚刚过去的联合国可持续发展峰会和联合国大会高级别周期期间，世界各国领导人全面对17项可持续发展目标的状况进行审查，并发现，在气候灾害、冲突、经济衰退和 COVID-19 等多因素持续影响的叠加作用下，全球可持续发展的整体进程几十年来首次出现倒退。 因此，为达成巴黎协定的温控目标，实现全球的可持续发展，各方需加强通力合作，投入更多的资源，推动技术创新，通过一系列研讨对话、政策引导和金融支持，努力减缓气候变化的进程。作为负责任的大国，中国在2020年的联合国大会一般性辩论上提出了2项目标：二氧化碳排放力争于2030年前达到峰值，努力并争取2060年前实现碳中和。双碳目标体现了中国应对气候变化的决心和对全球的人类命运共同体的责任。中国制定和实施了一系列应对气候变化的战略、法规、政策等，加快构建碳达峰、碳中和1+N 的政策体系，优化调整产业及能源结构，加大温室气体排放控制力度，充分发挥碳市场机制作用，积极探索符合中国国情的绿色发展道路。虽然极端气候事件对于不同国家、不同部门造成的影响存在差异，但面对气候危机这一全球性议题，没有一个国家可以置身事外。为此，我们需要继续坚持多边合作，建立公平合理、合作共赢的全球气候治理体系，积极推动应对气候变化全球合作，为推进全球气候治理进程注入强大动力。今天，我们有幸邀请到了来自国内外气候、环境、社会治理和国际合作领域的专家和学者，希望今天的对话能够开启全球关于气候治理更大范围的讨论，让我们携手应对气候危机，保护全人类赖以生存的地球。再次感谢各位专家出席今天的活动，各位屏幕前的观众对活动的关注，同时也感谢来自卡内基气候治理倡议的各位支持和主办方：清华大学可持续发展研究院、清华大学产业发展与环境治理研究中心的同仁们。谢谢大家，预祝本次论坛圆满成功。
好的，谢谢薛兰教授的致辞，他也表达了对现场的所有嘉宾的感谢和支持，欢迎。好，下面呢，我们进入引导发言哈。今天我们很有幸邀请到 IPCC 副主席 Tsinghua Kruger 女士为我们带来的演讲。她的主题呢是管理气候过冲风险，太阳辐射干预的潜在作用。好，我们非常掌声有请 Kruger 女士。
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Zhu. And also, I would like to say good morning to all our experts in this discussion and all those that are hearing this dialogue today. So let me at the onset thank the hosts of this meeting, obviously, the Institute for Sustainable Development Goals at the Tsinghua University and also CIDEG. First, for the initiative to promote this global dialogue on climate cooperation and governance, and also for inviting me to provide an introductory speech. So in this speech, I will address the issue of risks from climate overshoot and the potential role of solar radiation modification in managing these risks. The basis for my presentation, it couldn't be different, is the findings of the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, during the last 6th assessment report. I hope to contribute to set the scene for the panel discussion that will follow later in this dialogue. So, of the emission scenarios that have been assessed by the IPCC, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels until the end of this century, some of these are referred to as having limited or no overshoot, whereas others are referred to as scenarios with higher overshoot. So defining overshoot, IPCC defines in the glossary that temperature overshoot is a temporary exceedance of a specified level of global warming, say 1.5 degrees Celsius, that then returns to that level or below before the end of a specified period, say the end of this century. The issue is that temperature overshoot substantially increases the risk of release to the atmosphere of the carbon stored in the biosphere due to increased wildfires, tree mortality, insect and pest outbreaks, peatland drying, and permafrost thaw, for instance. So in summary, if global warming transiently exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, then many human and natural systems may face additional severe risks compared to remaining below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So depending on the magnitude and duration of the overshoot, some impacts will cause the release of additional greenhouse gases, and some will be irreversible, even if global warming is reduced. So IPCC includes examples of regional key risks based on the magnitude of adverse consequences, such as pervasiveness of the consequences, degree of change, irreversibility of consequences, and other factors. So additional warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius during an overshoot period this century, for instance, will result in irreversible impacts on certain ecosystems with low resilience, such as polar mountain and coastal ecosystems impacted by glacier melt or by accelerating sea level rise. Obviously, rapid, profound, and sustained emission reductions will increase the likelihood of limiting warming to the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. Nonetheless, researchers are investigating deliberate large-scale intervention options as potential supplements to deep mitigation, such as, for instance, in overshoot scenarios. In this context, solar radiation modification encompasses a suite of intervention options aiming at modifying the Earth's shortwave radiation budget and mask the climate effects of greenhouse gas emissions. So SRM options are not climate mitigation options, since they do not address the root cause of the climate change problem, which is the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Modeling studies have consistently shown that SRM has the potential to offset some effects of increasing greenhouse gas on global and regional climate, such as changes in extremes of temperature and precipitation, changes in the frequency of tropical cyclones and intensity as well, and the melting of the Arctic Sea ice and mountain glaciers. One of the most researched SRM options, the stratospheric aerosol injection, could, for instance, limit warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the climate response to solar radiation modification interventions is uncertain, as already has been pointed out, and varies across the climate models. But by appropriately adjusting the amount, the latitude, altitude, and timing of the aerosol injection, modeling studies suggest that SAI, the stratospheric aerosol injection, is conceptually able to achieve some desirable combination of radiative forcing in climate response. But there is a large uncertainty in the stratospheric response to SAI, and the change in stratospheric dynamics and chemistry would depend on the amount, size, type, location, and timing of the injection. SRM has the potential to limit climate change impacts, even if atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations continue to increase. But the issue is that the potential implications of SRM on various dimensions of sustainable development are not yet well understood. There is low confidence in our understanding of the climate response to SRM, and the IPCC stresses that this is particularly so at regional scales. But there are also concerns about the implications of a sudden and sustainable termination of SRM, especially in high emission scenarios that could cause a rapid climate change, the risk of moral hazard, and the fear of a political pressure for a quick decision on SRM when the potential implications are still unclear. So thinking of these risks, why then might SRM be necessary? Well, in a risk context, that is, judging the risks of application of SRM against the risks of climate change without the intervention, SRM could make sense in a world experience or expected to experience severe climate change impacts. This explains why considering the impacts of SRM in isolation may be misleading, as SRM's sole reason of being is the reduction or avoidance of climate impacts stemming from elevated greenhouse gas concentrations. Hence, the assessment of the potential effects from SRM needs to take into account a multitude of socially relevant parameters rather than a single one. So there is high agreement in the literature that for addressing climate change risks, SRM is, at best, a supplement to achieving sustained net zero or net negative CO2 emission levels globally. And also stresses that the co-evolution of SRM governance and research provides a chance for responsibly developing SRM technologies with broader public participation and political legitimacy, guarding against potential risks and harms relevant across a full range of scenarios. So I hope that with this I have given a very broad scenario from some elements in the IPCC. Obviously, there are benefits, but there are risks, many of them unknown, and especially because when you have a portfolio of options under SRM, some are mature, more mature than others, some cost more, some cost less. But I would like to leave just a final note that also IPCC mentions that research is ongoing in SRM, basically laboratory, and I see that China is possibly the only developing country that is carrying out or putting a lot of investments in this research along with other developed countries. It would be important and this is my view personally, that we should engage more developing countries, because as I said, the risks of SRM deployment might have regional effects, and so everybody should know the effects and make a wise decision or informed decision if that comes to the table of the decision makers. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, And I hope that this initial speech just sets the scene for the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
好的，好，谢谢Gruger 女士的精彩发言。她对我们这个气候过充的背景以及相关的太阳辐射干预的这潜在的作用以及挑战进入了深入的阐述。那么下面呢，我们有请就在应对全球气候变化这个中中国也在积极的寻求新的方案。那么接下来呢，我们有请中国21世纪议程管理中心黄金主任来发表主旨演讲。他将为我们分享的是巴黎协定目标下关于技术的讨论，CCUS 和 SRM。好，咱们有请黄金主任。
好，谢谢朱玉峰院长。这个我共享屏幕了，相信能看到吧？
没问题。
好，感谢清华大学和卡内基这个气候治理这个 initiative 共同做了这样一个很好的活动。这个坦率的说，我也是第一次参加这个关于 SRM 的这样一个讨论今天参加会议的专家和有关的这个代表层次都很高。刚才这个克鲁格女士从 IPCC 的角度阐述了 SRM 的一些非常清晰的观点我也学习到很多东西也看到亚诺西帕斯特也是老朋友能够在线上见到，他30年前就参加我们中国21世纪议程的制定这个有一章是气候变化，那个时候我们就讨论这个问题。确实时间很快，那个今天能讨论这么一个前沿的一个话题，我也是感到很荣幸有一些不成熟的一些想法在这里跟大家分享一下那么在中国谈这个问题呢，刚才我也注意到朱格女士讲我们是唯一的发展中国家，那么在做这个事情。那其实呢确实是实际上做的也是应该说比较初步的毕竟它还是比较前沿的。我们也很重视这样一个活动，我也找了专家，会前做了认真的讨论。我们目前很难用一个词儿来形容 SRM， 就是说我们有时候说这个事情是大众的，那么这个是一个小众的东西，也觉得不太合适。那说它是一个边缘一点的这个技术，也不是非常的这个合适。总之就是说现在这个问题，我想从 IPCC 的角度呢，它是对减缓和适应一个补充吧，大概这样一个定位呢，我觉得目前我至少个人觉得是可以来探讨的那除了讲 SRM， 因为我们做的工作不是特别多。那么从这个会议的内容看呢，我们有这个碳捕集利用于封存，我觉得还是可以花一点时间把这个相关的碳捕集利用于封存呢简单的介绍一下。那么我们对碳捕集利用于封存呢是基于巴黎协定和我们中国科学家包括清华大学我们这个判断，就是说我们在可以预见的近期很难完全绝对的排除化石能源的使用，所以那么我们最后要用的这一点化石能源，无论是本世纪的下半叶的什么时候，我们需要碳捕集利用于封存。所以这个呢，我们有一些估算大概有一个5到20几亿吨的量。那么同时现在我们还在用，特别中国还在用煤，那么全球也在用。我们现在如果不加装这个 CCUS 呢， 会造成大量的资产的搁浅啊，对经济来说是一个损失。那么从 CCUS 的作用来看啊，根据 IEA 的估算，那么今后大概有15%，也就是每年有100多吨的啊，这个100多吨的104吨的需要这个CCUS 来进行补给啊封存。那么现在呢，有 DAC 和BECCS 在技术在不断的这个发展，比起 SRM 来呢，它发展的更快一些，有时候呢也能更看得见摸得着一些。这个其实中国也正刚刚开始。那么我们和全球 CCS 研究院统计了一个数据呢，目前全球的这个大型的 CCUS 有233个啊，有一些在运行，有些在规划，有些在2、3个在停滞啊，各有各的原因。那么好的现象呢是说，以前我们的这个碳捕集利用封存呢，都在一些比较容易的领域，比如说它本身就是去驱油啊、化工啊，做一些产品。现在呢，随着时间，大家看这个坐标到2020几年到3这10年的这种趋势，向难减排领域发展，钢铁啊、水泥啊这些，这是一种好的趋势。那么大家很关注中国刚才薛兰院长讲到2020年我们在联合国承诺这个碳中和。那么自从那个以后呢这个实际上是我们“十四五”的开端。所以大家看这个时间轴，在2020年之后把 CCUS 就纳入到我们国家的5年的计划“十四五”规划当中去了。那么在近期有100万吨的有甚至更大的都进入了实施和规划，这对中国来讲是很重要的。那么我们的这样有个量化的东西在这儿呢，就是说我们有这个从现在这个在100亿吨左右的这样一个排放，到未来这么几十年，有这样一个量，总体量要减到最后一个净零排放。我们这个 A5 这个 CCUS 它要发挥一个比较大的一个作用，这个量这个颜色在我们的3个时段，特别是 T3 从50年到60年，它会占有很大的比例。所以我们在这个前端可以说这个减排的一种补给利用的这个技术上还是有不少发展。那么作为科学技术部我们制定了一个技术发展路线图正在做。那么这里可以看到，在这5大类补给、运输、化学生物利用、地质封存和集成优化与世界的先进水平，这个打星号的是先进水平相比大部分还是处于一种追赶和一种跟进的这个阶段。那么第二呢，就回到我们这个碳管理到这个风险管理的这样一个观点的一个表述上，从我个人角度来给大家分享一下。就是说我们现在说了碳捕集、封存和利用是补给、运输、储存一部分的利用，但是现在在国际上呢，对 CCS、CCUS、CDR包括现在的 SRM， 还有甚至是太阳地球工程SDG， 都有不同的一些表述。那么我们也很重视和尊重 IPCC 在这个方面的一些科学的论断。那么在某些方面还是有很多不一样的。最近呢，我去参加几个会，美国也好，包括世界主要经济体论坛也好，那么提出了一个碳管理 carbon management 这样一个 terminology， 讲这么一个概念，能够把我们整个的关于碳的一些处理希望能够概括进去。但实际上呢，也有一定的难度。但不管怎么说，我们看到了，在我们碳捕集、封存与利用之外，我们加上 CDR 成为一种碳管理的这样一种一种理解呢，我们觉得还是有价值的。那么今天我们来讨论这个 SRM， 就更加在这5个东西之外，在碳管理之外又增加了一个补充，我觉得这样形成了一个我们对这个问题的逻辑一个框架。因此我们现在要去思考，以前是对 CCUS 再到碳管理的这种风险的一种考量。现在呢，刚才这个克鲁格女士也提到了，那么我们 SRM 呢，整体上也会有很多对于它的风险的一些考量。有一些观点认为呢，就是常规的这个 CDR， 包括我们说的碳管理，最后解决不了问题，那么可能 SRM 呢，可能就是为数不多的一个办法了哈。我们现在呢觉得，有点像，我一直跟专家在谈的，有点像我们这个比喻不一定合适，就说我们这个地球生病了，现在有这么一个麻烦事情，我们中国人呢有中医，那西方现在西医也很发达，我们引进这个病呢，如果发展下去会很严重，西医也治不了，中医也治不了减缓也不行，适应也麻烦，最后怎么办？有没有一个什么办法来把它治？很难的。有没有？有比如说它有什么锻炼心理治疗最后有没有什么特异功能我们这个地球工程，我们跳出我们这个地球，从整个太阳地球工程的角度来看，这个是一个我觉得应该确实鼓励科学家去探索的东西。那么在这样的一些技术当中，我们从中国的角度来说有很多确实还是比较有一点点科幻概念，但是比如说平流层气溶胶，比如说还有其他的这些东西，都是目前可以看得见基本摸得着可以去试验的东西所以我们也是觉得可以去做的发展中国家也应该加入到这个研究的行列当中。事实上，中国从很早的973计划，还有国家科学自然基金都资助过但是不多。我们的陈莹教授他参加过这些工作最早的973呢，我们是一个团队最早做的，但是也觉得挺有意思，他牵头的呢还是一个英国人，所以我们这项工作还要多加强。顺便也给各位专家汇报一下，我们21世纪中心呢，目前转移到这个改革转移到国家自然基金委，我觉得更有条件来在这个基础研究方面多做工作。那么在这个 SRM 方面的一些引发的一些讨论风险这些我就不在这里展开了，这些可能大家比我更清楚。那么他有一个问题提出来，就是说 SRM 可以在最后，就相当于我刚才说的，最后解决不了的时候给你提供一个解决的办法，但是这种解决的办法带来的新的问题怎么办？就好像我们这种药吃下去，这个症状是没有了，好了，可是它有别的副作用出来，我们怎么解决是用药上面再来辅助呢，还是由我们事先对它的风险进行了评估这样我们觉得是会更好在这两者之间如何平衡。最后呢，我们来说3个要素。这个呢，因为 SRM 还没有展开做，我想就用 CCUS 作为例子。第一呢，就是技术上我们需要做很多我们现在还有很多方面，成熟度示范技术锁定中国地质封存的这种匹配都遇到很多挑战，所以还有很多缺陷。政策上，中国呢做了这个1+N 政策体系这个是我认为在各个国家当中，中国还是比较全的这样一个这个就是国务院出的1+N 各个部门，但是它也存在很多不足对，比如说 CCUS 举例来说， 针对性方面、约束性方面、更大的激励方面都还不足，那就更不用说 SRM， 对吧？这个政策目前确实还是没有很明确的。第二个就是说，我们的市场，我们这个成本还很高，所以你要进行商业化模式还很难。那么我们需要这个政策、技术、市场三者给它结合起来，我们才能实现真正的有一个商业化驱动，这个事情才能够成。那么对于 SRM 来说呢，我们也同样是技术上，我们现在确实还有很大的这样一个距离。政策上，我们还需要在国内来继续的推啊，国际上其实也推过，有的地方也是有争议的啊。你比如说，联合国环境大会在瑞士提交的 SRM 19年就没有完全通过，但是下面呢也是有很多好的迹象，无论从欧美啊都在有治理框架和规划出台。那市场就还比较早了啊，现在谈 SRM 的市场还比较早了。可是我们注意到美国的 SRM 相关的初创公司啊，这个 Make Sunset 这个，它已经开始出售这种冷却信用的额度了，也就是在这种 SRM 的这种干预的手段下，产生了一定的降温的额度。我觉得这都是一些我们能够看到的好的迹象。因此，下一步对中国来讲，我想有这么几个问题：第一，是不是要在基础研究方面加强；第二，是不是要对相关人员进一步加深对 SRM 的了解；第三，是不是要在这个我觉得是需要的科普提高这个 awareness；第四是国际合作非常的重要。我们今后呢，我们愿意21世纪中心也加强和大家这方面的一些沟通和加深理解和合作。谢谢大家。
好，非常感谢黄金主任的精彩发言。可以说 CCUS 和 SRM 都是非常前沿的新的技术。CCUS 呢，当然我们已经讨论的比较多在很多这个低碳、双碳领域的专家们其实讨论很多。SRM 呢，确实是一个相对来说比较前沿，拿黄金主任的这个话来说，可能还是有点科幻的一个技术。但是呢，正因为如此我们一方面我们要加大对这种技术的研究，同时呢，也要提前对这个技术可能产生的技术以及治理等方面的相关的这个挑战进行提前的预判，然后加强我们对这种新的技术在进行评估，以及未来我们对这个技术的更好的使用。那么好，下面呢，我们进入这个圆桌讨论的环节。本次的讨论将由卡内基气候治理倡议的执行主任 Janos Pastor 来主持。那么嘉宾呢，将围绕气候变化治理以合作的主题开展讨论。我们这个参会的这个讨论的嘉宾包括Mesna 局长，还有Tino 司长，还有Sila 内阁主任，还有 Waitler 大使，以及陈莹主任。好，那么我们请这个嘉宾们打开麦克风和视频，然后参与讨论。同时呢，也欢迎我们 Zoom 会议室内直播平台上面的观众将你们的提问以文字的方式来发送出来。我们的工作人员将会在后台收集大家的问题，然后下一个阶段呢，我们会通过这个问题来请各位专家来回答。好，那么我们来有请这个 Janos 来做主持。
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for your words, and thank you for the two keynotes. I think what we heard from there are some very useful elements for our discussion already. Managing toward a low carbon or zero carbon world is challenging. It's difficult. It can be done. It can be done, but it is difficult. And to use Huang Jing's word, there is no magic solution out there. We have to work hard. Now, the bottom line is that we need to, all this is mainly because of the consumption of and emissions from fossil fuels. And the world needs, in a sort of absolute priority, transformative, substantial emission reductions, maybe supplemented by carbon capture and storage, or also removal of excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and of course adaptation to contribute to alleviate the impacts of the warming that is already committed. The challenge that we face is that even according to the IPCC reports, all of the above, even if we do everything intensively, may not be enough. And the world may need to rely on additional temporary emergency measures such as SRM. We don't know if it will. It's only a question of may at this point. But then the questions arise, given the climate crisis, should we use or not stratospheric aerosol injection in particular? Should we research it or not? Or should we even talk about it? These are the questions that many people address, and I think some of our panelists will address these questions one way or another. C2G, throughout the 7 years of our existence, we have made sure that we remained impartial about whether or not these technologies should be used, but we were not impartial about the need to discuss these issues and bring these issues to the attention of governments and also non-state actors. Now, but there is another issue. It's not just the climate crisis. Of course, it's in the context of the overshoot that we're talking about these issues, but there is also the risk related to the lack of governance. And that's also the IPCC was very clear about that. The risk of the lack of governance is a risk by itself. It can lead to unilateral actions and all kinds of other issues. So, we don't have the robust, comprehensive framework at the intergovernmental level to handle this. Neither do we have in place the kind of governance that is needed for societal engagements and discussions about these complicated issues. So, the objectives of this panel discussion will be to explore how can one approach these governance gaps and do that from different perspectives. We have an excellent panel with us, and maybe I'll just share a few words about how I imagine these next 45 minutes now, because we want to make sure that there is time left for question and answers. So I will ask the panelists to first to introduce themselves, not just to say who they are and where they work, but also what is it that interests them in engaging on discussions about solar radiation modification, what is of interest, what is of concern, and so on. About a minute each. Then I will ask each panelist a question, an initial question, which I hope they can address in about 3 minutes. They will all be similar, but maybe with a slightly different twist. I hope that they can address these initial questions in a couple of minutes. And then I hope that there will be some exchange between the panelists themselves. I would certainly encourage the panelists to ask each other questions and maybe follow up with a comment or an alternative perspective on those issues. And if needed, depending on how discussions go, I will also come in with a question or two. And then I will hand back to our chair for managing a question and answer session with the participants. I understand we have a very large number of participants following this session. That's great. So I hope that some interesting questions will come out of that. So I will definitely want to make sure that our panel discussion leaves enough time for the question and answer session. So with that, let me stop talking and let me start asking the panelists for their self-introduction. Maybe I could start with Joe Tyndall, if you could say a few words. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Janos. And we're already off to a really fascinating start with this panel. So I'm the director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD, and that means my perspective on geoengineering technologies comes from a climate and environmental point of view. And I think that one of the singular advantages of the OECD is its cross-disciplinary approach. So even though I'm coming at it from my perspective, I'm working very closely with other directorates within the organization. For example, one dealing with science, technology, and innovation, a directorate dealing with governance issues that are relevant to what we're talking about here. So we all know from our work that taking rapid transformative action on climate change is vital, given the recent indisputable evidence that the planet is already approaching dangerous climate tipping points today. So I'll talk when we come back to the key question about geoengineering, particularly SRM. And the key point I want to use as my starting point in that discussion will be, as we already know, we are making progress towards net zero, but my God, it's way, way, way too slow. And we have to focus our efforts on behavior change and innovation that are going to deliver warp speed emissions reductions. And that's very different from relying on mopping up an ever worsening mess after the fact. I'll stop there and talk more later.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can go on to Dirk Messner, please.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Dirk Messner. I'm the president of the German Environment Agency, and therefore I'm coming from the environmental perspective. Obviously, my agency is responsible for climate protection policies and obviously the overshooting discussion. Janos, we had a debate on this recently in Beijing, is high on the agenda also in our discussions, right? And therefore negative emissions is something we are looking into currently. So CCS questions, CCU questions, carbon dioxide removal issues. And we are also looking at SRM. I'm talking about this a bit later and how I look at it and how I balance the risks. But we are looking at all these different options because we are in it, as Joe, as you have been mentioning, we are really in a challenging and critical situation. Maybe one last session, because we are here in a group of people where China plays an important role. I'm also co-chairing the Track 2 dialogue with China. So it's a Chinese-German Track 2 dialogue between experts on energy and climate. And in this context, I'm listening very carefully how my Chinese colleagues are looking at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Sheikh Sila, are you there? I don't see your picture, but yes, you're there. Perfect.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sheikh Sila from Senegal. I used to be Director of Environment and Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister of Senegal and Head of Staff in the Ministry of Environment, but by now expert to many areas, including climate. I started the negotiation on climate from the beginning, 1990, before the convention, and I follow also the Vienna Convention, the Montreal Protocol, and chemical-related MEAs. You asked me to speak about the Global South. I don't have the pretension to speak on the Global South, but some African perspective. As Africa is in the Global South, maybe that can respond to some questions that you may ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. And next, I have Chen Ying, please.
大家好，我叫陈莹，来自中国社会科学院可持续发展研究中心我是副主任。我从2015年开始参与了这个中国的刚才黄晶主任介绍的有关地球工程的973的研究项目。我从那时候起呢，就持续的关注这个 SRM 的这个治理的问题。我从2022年开始呢，这个参与了联合国教科文组织 UNESCO 下边的叫世界科学知识与技术伦理委员会，加入这个委员会。我们这个委员会呢，最近呢正在起草一份关于 气候工程的伦理学问题的这个报告。我等下呢会跟大家分享一下这个报告的一些主要的要点。谢谢。
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Felix Wertley, please.
Thank you very much, Janos, and good afternoon, good morning to all of the colleagues. My name is Felix Wertley, and I'm the Ambassador for the Environment in Switzerland. I'm heading the International Affairs Division here, and I'm also the head of delegation for the climate change negotiations. Perhaps 2 points at the outset of this. For sure, I'm here as a government official, so I represent kind of a policymaker's view, a government's view. And I think what we have heard already, also introductory remarks about the context, also the findings of the IPCC. For us, it's clear that we should look at this topic. We should not shy away from a discussion. We need more information about that. And for sure, that's always in the context that we have to focus totally on mitigation. We have to do much more mitigation, and discussing SRM to enable us to access information should never be an excuse to reduce any efforts on the mitigation side. I think that's really clear that this is also as the outset as a starting point. And when we talk about mitigation, I think we have also talk about adaptation. I think moral hazard often is related to the mitigation efforts. In our view, it's also getting more and more involved in the adaptation field. So we have really to do all our efforts to strengthen work on mitigation and adaptation, even if we collect information on SRM. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then with that, let's go into the substance. And I'd like to follow the same order for now. Joe, if we could start with you, and if you could share with us a few thoughts about what you see are the major gaps for the governance of solar radiation modification.
Thanks very much, Janos, and I appreciate getting the floor back again. To pick up where I left off, I think that I really want to agree with the speakers who have come before me, that geoengineering technologies shouldn't be our line of first resort. And that applies equally to CCUS, which does seem likely to be an important part of the toolkit. But as it is applied, it really shouldn't prolong a dependency on fossil fuels. I heard someone describe geoengineering as a kind of, should come with a warning notice, break glass in case of emergency. They can and will play a role in staying within that 1.5 degree guardrail that we're so close to breaking through, and making sure that if and when we do break through it, there is very limited overshoot. But technologies are more uncertain and potentially riskier, and that applies particularly to SRM. And there are associated scientific, ethical, and geopolitical risks. So just very quickly to pick up on that, the first key point is that there are lots of known unknowns about these technology, but likely to be unknown unknowns as well. There's a significant knowledge gap in these technologies, SRM in particular, with direct implications and impacts on governance. So our work at the OECD basically concludes that SRM technologies aren't yet a feasible policy option to manage the dangerous impacts of climate change, given that considerable risk associated with them and the limited research available to date. And in the further discussion, it might well be worth exploring the implications of what China is currently doing in relation to research already. So those risks associated with the deployment of SRM today range from the doubtful. Sorry, I think there's a translation coming through. Hopefully it'll calm down now. The range from the doubtful to the potentially terrifying, whether that's through altered temperature and precipitation patterns, acid rain, or changes in stratospheric ozone and surface radiation. And just to give one example of cloud seeding, for example, I mean, it's being used already by some countries, and it's not quite in the same league, but it's related. If it's used to increase precipitation in one locality or within one country's national sovereignty territory, that can have implications of reduced rainfall in neighboring countries. So there are governance and cross-territorial issues that have to be dealt with. More research is going to be necessary to understand the risks as well as our capabilities, and increasing transdisciplinary research efforts to inform climate change response strategies would be a really good place to start. So from our perspective, the efforts need to put transparency, justice, and I think Thelma already touched on this, and broad engagement as their core to limit the risk of path dependency. And by that I mean an internal momentum to reach a particular result. And that path dependency would over-rely on the deployment of SRM technologies. The second point is that bridges are going to have to be built among countries and between policy communities and research institutions to share progress and the results of different research efforts into SRM technologies. The second major gap, governance gap, is institutional. There's just not the necessary national and international governance infrastructure currently in place. We don't have a multilateral forum where any potential geopolitical tensions arising from research, let alone the deployment of SRM technologies, can be addressed. I think you asked a question at the outset. I don't think we can pretend or hope that geoengineering options won't be explored, whether by governments or private actors. So it is way better to be prepared and assume that they will be on the horizon. More broadly, I think we live in a particularly challenging time for international cooperation. Despite, and in part because of this, a multilateral forum where discussions on governments and regulatory frameworks for SRM can take place is, we think, essential. And conversations to raise awareness of these issues, just like the one we're having here today, are an essential step towards achieving that necessary governance framework. So in summary, geoengineering technologies will very likely be needed to supplement other climate mitigation actions, but definitely shouldn't supplant them. More research is needed to better understand the risks as well as the opportunities that might be derived from them. And this must also be the foundation for filling the governance gaps that are pretty yawningly wide at the moment. Thanks, Janos.
Thank you very much, Joe, and you raised lots of important issues. My insights are burning with lots of questions, but I won't put any at the moment because we're a little bit behind the time. So let's leave that for now. And I would like to go to Dirk now and ask him how he sees the potential risks and benefits of SRM. And in that context, how do you see possible routes to strengthen international governance frameworks around this emerging or new technique? And how do you see the role of governments and non-state actors, such as academia and civil society in that? So there's many questions, but I hope you can try to address them briefly. Thank you.
I will try to structure it a little bit, Janos. So I think I can build very well on what Joe, you just already said. You know, for me, that the main toolbox is mitigation, deep and accelerated, adaptation, next step, and we need it anyway. And carbon dioxide removal is something we need to invest in rapidly because overshooting issues are on the table, and staying below even 2 degrees global warming is very challenging. This is my first thought. Now, my second thought is, and I'm starting with my conclusions already and then coming to bring the arguments why I'm coming to this conclusion. Looking at SRM, I would argue that we should avoid solar radiation management if possible. And we should not define it as a climate protection policy technology, because it is not. And I support the discussion about governance and about global governance. And in this context, I'm arguing with a network of international scientists, a solar radiation non-use agreement. This is also a global governance arrangement because we have voices driving into this direction and we need rules and standards for that. Joe, you mentioned this. Now, we are in a critical situation in which global cooperation is so challenging and under pressure in many fields. So how do we find common standards in this field? I'm arguing for a social radiation management non-use agreement. So why so? And I have four main arguments which I would like to bring to your minds. And the first one is that solar radiation management does not address the root causes of climate change. We already heard this from different voices. I agree on that. I emphasize this. It's not helping to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. It's merely masking global greenhouse gas emissions and therefore stabilizing, and I'm agreeing on that, it's stabilizing global warming processes, no? But it is not bringing the global emissions down as the drivers of the whole process. My key argument is very similar to, Joe, what you said and what Thelma also mentioned. No? The main argument is that we don't know the ecosystem-related impacts of solar radiation management. Those will be global because we are manipulating a global system if you move into this direction. And this is about high uncertainty, therefore high risk. It is about unknowns, actually. Joe, you mentioned this, no? We do not even know the unknowns. It is about unknown unknowns, which we are having in front of us. This is my strongest argument. My third point, which I would like to make, is that if we move into this direction, if you would have a global decision to start an SRM process internationally, no? I mean, this would not be a one-shot event. We needed to move forward with this technology forever because we are only masking the global warming process. If we would stop, we might trigger a global warming shock. And this is something which we need to have in mind. This is my third argument. And my fourth argument is, of course, I'm listening that there are everyday louder voices arguing in favor of solar radiation management because the overshoot is there, and we have to find solutions for that. And the impacts of global warming are severe. Therefore, many countries are asking for answers, right? My answer, as I said, is mitigation, adaptation, carbon dioxide removal. Carbon dioxide removal is looking at the root causes. No? The effort would be to bring carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. This is something which we can do. It's still very expensive, but it does not have the same risks impacts as solar radiation management from my perspective has. So if a group of countries would decide to move into this direction, and this is not a very expensive technology actually, no? It is about 10 billion a year or so to start a large scale event. This might result into, you told it, Joe, geopolitical conflict situations, no? Because there would emerge the question of who actually is legitimate to move into this direction, because what a group of countries then might do would have global implications. No? So geopolitical tensions, conflicts between different interest groups, I would like to see this prevented. Therefore, my plea for solar radiation non-use agreement efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. And again, the same story. I will just move on just to make sure we have enough time for discussion between the panelists. So I would like to ask Sheikh Sila now to look at maybe from your perspective, what are some of the possible routes to strengthen international governance frameworks around SRM? And how do you see the role of China, of African countries from your perspective in this area? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Africa is extremely concerned with SRM technology. And so we had the opportunity to develop a study in 2020 and 2 workshops for knowledge sharing in 2022 for African perspective with regard SRM. Africa is also concerned that the focus on negotiating a governance system for this emerging SRM technology will take time and potentially further develop political will and resources. away from obligation to implement and finance proven policies, technology, and measures under the UNFCCC framework. Africa also is further concerned that the same technology, in terms of current state of knowledge, will have potentially severe transboundary impact and implication across multiple sectors and areas of legal jurisdiction. Given the global and transboundary nature, it is important to be considered by relevant mandated bodies within the UN system involving the African Minister Conference on Environment at scientific, technical, political, and legal level, while recognizing the importance of international control to prevent the unilateral advancement of SRM technology. Africa is not yet, I think, ready to support any engagement on possible broader international governance matters related to this technology, given the above mentioned limited level of understanding and considering that existing body within the UN system have the mandate to address any immediate geoengineering concern that may arise. And finally, the African Group of Negotiation on Climate want to develop further consideration and report to the African Ministerial Conference of Negotiation for decision making. And in light of this concern and high degrees of uncertainty around this technology, and notably the SRM, Africa should not support their application at this stage, but should rather support the development of an authoritative scientific synthesis and review of the state of knowledge of the technology. The scientific assessment should be conducted by a mandated body such as the IPCC or any other entity as UNESCO and other, or together as a scientific and technical committee. But we need a broad participation with the research, the civil society, the stakeholders, as we know that the SRM have impact on mitigation and adaptation, and mainly on adaptation. And this one also involves geopolitical maybe problem to be tackled later on. And for that, I stop here. And I'm sorry to not be possible to continue the meeting with you because I have to close the African negotiation on plastic, preparing the ink tree in Nairobi in November. I'm sorry to leave the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheikh. And we of course understand that there are so many other processes going on. So thank you for your words, and we will maybe look at that together with the other panelists in the discussion. And then I will move on to the next speaker, and you leave when you have to leave. Thank you so much for participating. And now I come to Felix Wertli. If you could share with us, oh no, sorry. First I wanted to ask Chen Ying to share with us a few thoughts about the key conclusions of that UNESCO report that you were involved in, because I think that would be helpful for this discussion. But also, if partly also because of what Joe asked, maybe you could say a few words about the status of research and discussions of this issue in China. A bit more words than Wang Jing raised this also in his presentation, but just a little more detail on what's going on. Thank you. So over to you.
好，谢谢 Jonas 大家刚才呢已经谈了很多的观点啊，我觉得很多呢有趣的事情呢，我们可以接下来呢来这个讨论啊。很多的问题呢，或许目前呢还没有一个答案，但是讨论呢可以加深我们相互的理解。我想呢，这个就刚才几位嘉宾发言中的2个问题，先做一个澄清。一个呢是刚才呢这样提到的，这个一个地方这个增加下雨，是不是另一个地方那个雨水就会减少了？这个呢是人工影响天气， weather modification， 它跟我们今天所讨论的 SRM 这个太阳辐射干预是不是一个概念啊？那么中国呢，这个每年开展大量的人工影响天气啊，来增雨或者减少这个冰雹的危害啊。但是呢，它是在一个3000米的一个高空啊释放一些这个凝结核啊所做的，它跟我们今天讨论的要在平流层啊10000米高空来释放这个反光物质来为地球来降温，这2个技术啊是有着本质区别的，所以我想这是我想澄清的第一个问题。第二个问题呢，就是这个 SRM 的确是具有高风险和高不确定性的，但是呢，我们也不能一味的指责它的风险，因为做有风险，不做也有风险。我们不做的话，地球这个正在变暖啊，日益的啊，这个今年的7月份已经是全球平均温度已经比工业革命之前超过了1.5度啊，全球的这个极端天气气候事件所造成的严重的危害啊是非常的强烈的。预计呢，未来呢这种趋势的继续的持续啊，我们会看见越来越多的这个灾害冰雪在融化，海平面在上升啊，所以做有风险，不做也有风险。我们对于一个两难的境地啊，并需要它的衡量呢，这个需要在两害相权取其轻啊。我刚才提到呢，就是在 UNESCO 这个联合国教科文组织下啊，目前呢正在高度的关注这个 SRM 的问题啊。我们用的是 climate engineering 气候工程啊，跟 geoengineering 是差不多的，它其实是包括了 CDR 跟 SRM 啊都包括了。其实早在2010年的时候呢，这个 UNESCO 下边的一个委员会呢，就曾经发布过一个关于海洋施肥这个 ocean fertilization 的一个报告。在2017年的时候呢，这个 UNESCO 呢还发布过一个关于气候变化伦理原则的一个声明。从2022年我加入这个叫 COMEST 叫世界科学知识与伦理委员会。我加入之后呢，他们就把这个气候工程的伦理问题呢列成我们未来2年的一个重点工作所以呢，在起草一个关于气候工程伦理学的这个伦理问题的一个报告。在这个报告里呢，我们的确有很多的争论很多的作者呢意见也不统一。那么当时是说只针对 SRM 还是把 CDR 也包含进去？最后呢，我们是把这2种技术呢都包含进去了。对于这种不成熟的技术高风险、高不确定性，它所带来的伦理的问题我们是聚焦在这个方面，尤其是这个滑坡的风险和道德的风险这些伦理的问题。那么我们有很多的争论我们是用一个人类中心的中心主义，还是一个生态中心主义？我们当代人对于后代人是不是有责任去有更多的责任去维护这个地球的安全就是一个代际的伦理的问题。还有呢，就是一个差异性与风险的问题，就是我们很多的政策对于人群的影响是差异的，是不同的，是一些地方受害，一些人群受害，另外一方面另一些地方另一些人群受益，所以影响是具有差异性的。所以在讨论伦理学问题的时候呢，都要讨论到这个问题。那么这个报告最后呢，给出的一些建议呢，首先呢还是要进行开放的、负责任的 国际合作，要持续的来监测人类呢应对气候变化的各种气候行动，包括减缓，包括适应，包括 CDR， 也包括 SRM。SRM 我们还要区分出它的层次啊，我们现在是没有人敢说它支持大规模实施的，但是对于 SRM 的科学研究，我们报告总的来说还是支持进行必要的探索的。我们需要去了解它背后可能的影响啊，这个应该说它是一个人类最后很无奈的一剂猛药啊，有风险，但是可能是能够最快的为地球降温的啊这样的一个最后的一个无奈的选择。当然作为 UNESCO 的报告，它也特别强调了科学家、科学和研究在于提高公众认识方面扮演重要的角色，在教育和跟公众进行科学和社会之间的沟通的时候，那么我们需要这个 UNESCO 可以承担起更多的这个责任啊。我不知道我还有没有机会一会儿再进行第二次发言。我想介绍关于中国最近出台了2个技术伦理方面的文件啊，我想我一会儿再说啊，谢谢。
Thank you, and we're indeed running a little bit late. I see, Joe, you have your hand up. Can this wait until after Felix speaks, or do you want to quickly follow up on something now? You're on mute.
Pressing
Yes.
the wrong button. Yes, super quickly, I wanted to respond to the comment I had made about cloud seeding, and I recognize it is not the same at all as SRM. The point I was making was about transboundary consequences of techniques that may also be relevant to SRM. So any approaches to experimentation have to bear that in mind. And it also underscores the need for multilateral engagement before we're heading down the track towards any so-called last resort technologies. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. And now I'd like to come to Felix. Felix Bradley, please share with us your thoughts about what you see as the major gaps for the governance of SRM. What are the possible routes to strengthen international governance frameworks around this technology, and how do you see the role of China, Switzerland, and maybe other countries in moving this forward? Over to you.
Thank you, and a very interesting discussion so far. I think one key element is, if you want to talk about governance, have an enabled discussion, I think first of all we need a level playing field of information. I think that's a basic problem that we have, that not all governments, not all key actors, not all stakeholders have the same information. For me, that is a question of fairness, that all have. First of all, do we have the information that we need? We have talked about the unknown of the unknown, and also that, first of all, do we have the information that we need? And secondly, do we have access to this information? And for sure, there's also what I was mentioned before, the question of the global south, small island states, and so on. Do they have the access they need? When we talk about science or information at this stage, I think there are some basic elements that we should be informed about. And that is for sure the state of science. What do we know? Perhaps what don't we know yet? It is the risk and benefits. Transboundary impacts have been mentioned as an example, but much more is adverse effects on the environment, on the food security and so on, that we should know about that. We have also heard some activities are ongoing, but also we have heard some governance frameworks exist, so the mapping of the existing governance frameworks, and also information of what kind of activities, projects, perhaps big actors are involved at this stage. Important also when we talk about governance frameworks, it would be interesting to know more about national, regional, and international existing ones. There was also the question, would it be important to have kind of a regular update of information of what is going on, so kind of a monitoring of those activities to inform decision makers, policy makers about that. Another important point is also for the status of research. Is what kind of research is going on? I think we see it's still at quite a low level, but it's also increasing, more actors are getting involved. And in case there would be tastings, it would be very much important that people are informed about testing activities. Also to relate what Dirk Messner has mentioned, now you advocated for non-use agreement. My understanding is if you want to have an enabled discussion, that's always the basis to have access to information. So if the idea is to discuss a non-use agreement, if the idea is to prevent unilateral use, it's just the idea to discuss what kind of research is needed, how to frame this research, perhaps to control testing and so on. Access to information for policymakers is always the first step. And to my understandings, we don't have this access to information yet. We are lacking that. We have a number of reports now published, but we don't have this kind of comprehensive report. And one question could be, which are the forums to have such kind of report? No, and I think that UNEP for sure could play a particular role. The United Nations Environment Programme, there you have UNEA, so you have a body where you have universal membership. That means countries from the global south, global north, all types of countries are present there. UNEP has experienced in doing assessment, so collecting information that exists, so not establish basic science, but bring together existing knowledge. And they have methodologies how to enable access to information. So one element could be that we think about, should there be a mandate, for example, for UNEP, in what form ever, to provide this kind of assessment of informations that decision makers, policy makers, important actor stakeholders have the same level of knowledge to then also discuss further and have a good discussion about that. I think I forgot to say at the very beginning, apologize for that. When I talk here, I talk only about SRM. I think others like Dirk, like Thelma explain the differences. For sure, CDR is also an important toolbox. We have to look at it. There are also questions around some of the tools we will use to mitigate and to fight climate change. But I think there's also a good distinction between both of them, and that's why I did now here only focus on SRM. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. And we have just a few minutes before we need to hand this over for the Q&A session. First of all, thank you, Felix, for identifying a very basic part of governance, which is to have information and to have access to that information in a way that is fair and everybody is able to access that. So that's an important practical step that you suggested here. If you already referred in some cases to each other, but if you have any particular question or comment on what some of the other panelists said, please raise it now. We have maybe about 5 minutes where we could have a quick exchange between you. And that includes also Thelma and Huang Jing, if you're still there, please just feel free to react to what you've heard from each other. So I see Dirk's hand already, so please.
Thank you, János. I wanted to mention one point. I mean, there is a overarching consensus on the uncertainty issues. All of us mentioned this, no? And the second point, which we have been debating during the last hour or so, is how can science help us? Thelma, you also mentioned this. What do we know and what can we know? And I mean, the challenge here is that with the methodologies we have to do research on the impacts of SRM globally and locally are limited. So this will not, in the current situation in which we are, with the methods with which we are, we cannot answer the impact questions with our modeling exercises. This is the current state of the art. No? The second observation then is local experiments would not help us to understand global impacts. And short-term experiences would not help us to understand long-term SRM initiatives. No? So therefore, our possibilities to solve the knowledge questions are not at all easy to answer. No? And therefore, for me, the uncertainty issue and the limited possibilities to manage or to solve the knowledge problems, these two points have been brought together. And my conclusion out of that is then that I'm so skeptical as I expressed already. Thank you.
Okay. Thelma, please.
Yes, thanks, Janos. And Felix, I do share all the concerns that have put forward. And I'm speaking as Thelma, not as, former IPCC vice chair, which gives me a lot of degrees of freedom, to express my own thoughts every time we had, CIDEG events. I would say, I'm bounded to refrain myself from comments because of my role as IPCC vice chair. So I do share that with you, but I'm not so skeptical, Felix, in the sense that I personally think that it's not fair that there are ongoing efforts on modeling, despite the fact that these modelings might not provide the full answers to everything. They might partially provide some responses to some of the enormous number of concerns that we have, but it's already an advance. What I think is not fair is it's the uneven participation in the research efforts. If I take Brazil, Brazil is leading many things, but Brazil has nothing, no efforts in SRM at all. We do see in South America an effort in Argentina, pity money. I mean, it's just one concentrated effort in one single area of concern in SRM. So how could we be fair? And I don't think that at this point, it would be feasible to say we are not going to do anything else anymore. So let's stop it. I don't think that there is no going back in my vision. And especially, if I may say, with my degree of freedom, that oil and gas, sector is absolutely interested in pursuing more and more on this research theme, for the reasons that I don't have to say. So, in the terms, so I think that the governance of research is lacking. So I am pro-research, as I should be as a researcher myself, or used to be. So I am pro-research in this area, because I think we need to be prepared. As negotiator in the Climate Change Convention, we cannot, for instance, get caught into this discussion without being prepared as governments to respond to that. So I always say we need to be informed. And information means science, evidence-based. So in that respect, despite the fact that the modeling is not going to answer everything, it might partially give the governments and other stakeholders with some idea of what to expect. My main concern, Felix, is really what Joe has mentioned, the transboundary effects of the implementation, which we normally do not say small scale, we say large scale implementation, because else it's not going to, work. It might work normally with having transboundary effect. My fear is that some of the regional effects, which are not going to be then, as I said, equally distributed, might affect the areas which are most vulnerable to changes in precipitation pattern. And I mentioned more specifically Africa. So with all the problems, then if you have this, plus an impact from SRM large-scale deployment on less precipitation, that will affect agriculture, that will affect their economy. So, these are huge issues of, when we talk about justice, fairness, equity. I just want to go beyond, words and effectively think of the implications of these very strong wording in practice.
Thank you, Thelma, and thank you for your increased freedom of being able to address these issues. I see Felix's hand, so please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Thelma, for the remark. I don't know if there was a misunderstanding. I didn't speak against research. I think we need more research. And I think also this idea of a governance of research is important. What I talk about is about access to information. I think there we have a problem. You are a researcher, you have very much access to information. Many governments, depending on the structure, the resources they have, they might not have the access to the knowledge. We have seen that we have submitted 2019 a resolution at UNEA. It was mentioned in one of the presentations. Many government representatives were surprised about this topic. They were not informed about the topic. And that is a problem. And then we talk about access to information. What we think is that we need somehow to collect existing information, including status of science and so on, perhaps needs for further research. And then government representatives, policymakers should be informed about that. So we are not against the research. I think the idea of governance of research is very interesting, but what is lacking at the moment is a structure how we can inform policymakers, government stakeholders about what is happening in this field.
Thank you, Felix. And before handing back to our chair, I would just like to ask Jen Ying, if you could just say a minute about that paper that you wanted to talk about, the one that was prepared in China. I think that could be helpful for this discussion. So please.
我非常快的补充一个信息啊，在当前全球治理还非常匮乏，没有国际法可以制约类似这个 SRM 这种技术的时候，我觉得呢，国内的治理，国内的一些政策，一些是这个不可或缺的是非常重要的。那么我补充一个信息呢，就是在中国中国有一个提出了一个叫科技向善的概念，它的意思呢，就是在新一轮的科技革命和产业变革中，那么我们要这个把这种新的科技进步它可能是一个双刃剑，它有可能造福人类，但是呢，也有可能呢带来新的风险和灾难。所以呢，加强这个科技的伦理和治理的问题，那么中国政府呢现在已经开始重视。在2022年的3月份，中国呢出台了一个叫做关于加强科技伦理治理的一个意见。那么里头呢就强调了对于这个科学技术要合理控制这个风险要谨慎的对待不确定性，这个尤其是这些可能危及社会安全、公共安全、生物安全和生态安全的这些科技成果要谨慎的对待。这是一个这个文件。那么就在前几天在2023年的10月8号，那么科技部等10个部门又共同印发了一个叫做科技伦理审查办法的一个新的文件，那么试图呢建立一个科技伦理审查的机制。那么这里头呢也是呢在其中有一条是关于这个不直接涉及人或动物，但是可能在生命健康、生态环境、公共秩序和可持续发展方面可能带来伦理风险的这种科技活动应该接受科技伦理的审查。 那么就是中国正在试图建立一个机制，对于一些有争议的科技活动进行审查。我觉得这里头虽然没有点名是关于地球工程或者是 SRM， 但是我觉得它完全可以适用于在国内对于相关的这种争议的活动，那么进行一些规范我已经觉得呢，这是一个这个加强这个在国际治理制度还没有健全的情况下，通过各国的国内的政策和立法来加强自律，我觉得是一个加强治理的一个可行的途径谢谢。
Thank you very much, Sheshe. And I see you have your hand up if you have a quick follow-up point, and then I need to give the microphone back to our chair. So.
Yes, of course. And really just to suggest that we should approach this question of governance from the point of view of prevention of harm, rather than kind of from the point of view of having a firm intention to use or even more rely on geoengineering technologies. So that should underpin the collaboration that's going to be essential to strengthening international governance around SRM. And collaboration is, a good place to start is in research. And just to re-emphasize what I said earlier, and to kind of place it in that context of harm prevention, research collaboration should be based on principles of transparency, of justice, and of broad engagement to limit that risk of path dependency on the deployment of SRM. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to thank the panelists for a very interesting discussion. And now I'd like to hand the microphone back to Shufang, and please, you can facilitate the question and answer session. I believe we have a few questions for our speakers. So thank you very much.
好的，好，感谢各位专家的精彩的讨论。向大家宣布一个数据，截止到目前在线观看的人数已经达到超过了8500位，也就是说我们要得益于这样的一个在线直播的平台我们的观众已经远远的超过了一个大礼堂甚至于大会堂体育馆这样的一个规模下面呢我们也在后台收集了不少这个观众的提问，我们的工作人员也挑选了一些问题请Mrs. Group Crook and 黄金教授Jarvis 还有相关的这个圆桌嘉宾来进行回答。那么这个有些问题呢是用英文直接问的，那么我就用英文来问，然后如果用中文来问的话呢，我用中文请大家能够来切换你们的这个同传的这个通道The first comment and the question is from class Radonsky. The question is, before implementing SRM, it might be an option to broaden the scope of less risky activities, which might be based upon radiative forcing management. ISO has started some work on this option already in 2018 and might publish some technical papers on this option next year. Regarding this comment, do our guests have any latest update to respond?
我想简单说一下他说的是一些风险比较小的，但是同时也是辐射这个管理的技术其实 SRM 呢，它是包括很多技术的。我们觉得争议最大的 叫做平流层这个气溶胶注入技术啊。那么 SRM 里头也是有一些风险比较小的，比如说把全球的所有的屋顶都刷白，或者把冰川上盖上毯子，然后让它减少太阳辐射。但是这些风险小，但是它的作用也小啊。当然我们是应该不要贸然的去采取风险大的技术啊。但是呢，这些风险小的技术，它作用不足以这个就是为全球来降温，所以我觉得这个问题是不是这样来理解
？Okay, thank you, Professor Chen Ying. And do we have any more response? Mrs. Crook?
Yes, thank you. Just to stimulate the discussions. Yes, I thank you very much, Chen-Ming, for your comments. Obviously, when we talked about SRM, we are talking about a portfolio of options. And I think that we singularized one because it's the most studied, which is the stratospheric aerosol injection. And because we have more studies on this one, we know more the potential implications of a potential deployment. So I think, Janos, when C2G closed the business after 7 years, I would say, there is a very nice report that has been produced, and we see the evolution of the discussion on SRM broadly. If we look 7 years ago and how we stand now, you see a huge interest in getting to know more about it and investing into it. So I think that the issue of the other options, obviously the costs are different, the maturity of these options are different, and also not only that, but also the effect that these different options may have in terms of reducing the risks of the impacts from higher temperature, for instance. So I think that, getting back to, I think IPCC has done a very nice job in putting together tables that shows exactly where do we stand in relation to these different options in terms of maturity, cost, implications, including the implication of what we call, and that I mentioned, which is the determination effect. Some of these options do not have that determination effect. SAI does have that impact, depending on, it's going to depend on a very long time of being there as a technology, not only 1 year or 2 years. It's going to be a huge investment for many years and has to be global. So I think that it is interesting from this point. Our facilitator, if I could put a question myself, what would be identified as?
好的。
Yes, thank you. What are the barriers we see for a broader engagement of developing countries? Is it capacity building? And if it's capacity building, how do we break, this lack of capacity? Where do we start? Is it financing? I think that financing is easier to overcome. So what is seen, and I don't know if Chen Wing could, give some perspectives in that respect, in terms of what do you see as preventing more developing countries to participate more actively in the research in SRM, broadly speaking?
我谢谢您的提问啊。我觉得作为一个发展中国家的科研人员，这个主要的就是参与全球这个有关 SRM 治理问题的这个讨论哈。 主要的障碍呢，还是我们现有的研究是非常不足的。那么大家都觉得中国已经开展了很多的研究，那么其实呢，在中国呢，这个研究也是非常的初步啊。那么我们唯一的一个国家级的项目是在2015年到2019年，我们的这个首席科学家是英国人啊，这个张默教授啊。我们参与的呢是浙江大学和我们中国社会科学院。那么通过这个项目呢，我们也只是初步的啊，对这个地球工程的相关问题啊有一些初步的了解。在这个项目完成之后呢，就再也没有这个国家这个项目的支撑了。我对于这个 SRM 的这个研究兴趣啊，现在目前呢，完全是凭个人的兴趣啊，在进行一些这个跟踪和学习啊，其实没有任何的项目的支持。而在中国呢，这个关注这个问题的学者啊，我觉得也是非常的少，所以研究的不足啊，是我们难以对这个问题发表更多见解的啊一个最大的障碍。还不仅仅这个研究不足呢，我觉得经费的支持呢只是一个因素，人才的这个因素也是存在的啊，因为这样的一个问题呢，很多人还是把它作为一个很科幻的一个事情来看待啊，并觉得它很遥远啊。其实我是觉得它的研究应该是非常紧迫的啊。那么还有一些人呢，一些环保主义者呢，认为呢就不能研究，因为研究你们就会逐步的变成支持它，就会因为你们为了获得更多的研究经费，你们就会不断的支持这样的事情，所以有些人呢就认为谈都不能谈，研究都不能研究啊。其实我觉得研究是非常必要的啊。特别是我也非常支持要有这个公平啊、透明性啊，然后这个参与啊，就是公共参与啊，还有呢就是科学家呢要跟公众进行这个必要的交流啊，我们不要把它这个妖魔化啊，就是极端的恐惧。但是呢，也不能极端的乐观啊！我觉得这个应该是一个客观的研究的态度，而且呢是一个动态的。科技在不断的进步啊，这个气候变化的形势也在发展，我们还要以一个动态的这个观点啊来看待这样一个新兴的技术伦理和治理的复杂的问题。谢谢。
好的。谢谢陈英教授。那个 Dick， 您还有这个举手哈，但是呢，因为时间的关系，我觉得我们后面的问题啊，也可以作为和前面的问题一起合并一起讨论。所以呢，我先介绍一下那个下面的问题，好不好？下面的问题其实我觉得有2个问题啊，其实都是涉及到这个影响。那么我也把它合并起来一起说。一方面呢，是在全球经济正在恢复的阶段下，我们如何去看待 SRM 这样的地球工程它的经济的影响？同时呢，现在目前又是比较复杂的国际形势的情况下，各国的气候治理行动对全球的地缘政治风险会造成什么样影响？说白了，其实就是我们这样的一些政治的这样的一些气候的变化的行动对经济和对地缘政治会造成什么样影响？好，那个请德克先讲吧。
I mean, I see, if you look at the global economy and recession trends, which we see on the one hand side, and geopolitical turbulences and wars around the globe on the other hand side, this obviously have impacts on mitigation activities, because we are seeing that this is eroding in many countries, and climate negotiations are becoming more challenging. I mean, we even don't know the impact of the Israel-Palestine conflict on next COP. So things are becoming much more difficult on the mitigation front for these reasons, right? This is the first trend which I'm seeing. The second trend which I'm seeing is something which, Joe, you mentioned several times. I mean, for managing and handling and developing good standards for any kind of looking at solar radiation management, cooperation is needed, no? And cooperation currently is absolutely fragmented. And bringing actors together and looking for joint solutions in this turbulent situation is even more challenging. Therefore, also getting global governance debates on solar radiation management, Janos, we discussed this some weeks ago, no? Is as challenging and even more challenging as it is to come to good conclusions in the mitigation part. So this is the situation how I see it. And this implies that we are in troubling waters in all these fields where global cooperation is needed for, Thelma, this was your point, for transboundary dynamics, which we have to cope by communicating and finding joint solutions. No? And this is not the moment currently where this is coming together nicely. But if you allow me, I would like to mention another issue which has been debated beforehand and comes back, Thelma, to your question of fairness and bringing the global south in. My quick answer would be capacity building and huge funding, because if you look at research funds available for least developed countries, I mean near to zero, you know? And if these countries need to participate because impacts will be on their side, the hugest ones, no? From global warming and also from solar radiation management. So this is number one. But then which research options do we have? And I see three, no? And I would support strongly two ones. And the third one, we find ourselves in a dilemma. The first option which we have is the modeling stuff, right? And we need to develop this further because the modeling toolboxes which we have do not answer our uncertainty questions yet. But more research in this field is important and needed. And this does not have impacts on real ecosystems and real humans, right? So this is number one. Option number two is then small scale and local experiments in the field of solar radiation management. Okay, but we don't know the impact then on global levels and long-term impacts. So this is nice to have, but it does not solve our uncertainty issues. No? And then the third level is global experiments and long scale. No, this would help us to understand the uncertainties, Joe, you talked about, but this would be a real life global experiment, no? With maybe irreversible trends. So we find ourselves in a dilemma situation there. So I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher, I'm in favor of research, you know, but in this case, the research options are in this sense, no, limited. Thank you.
好的，谢谢。那就 title。
Recognize we're running very short of time, but I just wanted to pick up on the point Dirk had made about the global economic challenges we're all facing, and draw attention to a report and an initiative the OECD is working on called Net Zero Plus. And that is about options we can take for ensuring the resilience of the transition to net zero, as well as ensuring resilience to the impacts of climate change itself. So on that first point, the resilience of the transition, we're just facing challenge after challenge internationally, both, and those challenges have economic consequences that are forcing governments to make very difficult policy choices. What we want to emphasize is that we must, because we are so close to crossing those irreversible tipping points in the Earth system, we must prioritize without delay our efforts to reduce emissions urgently. That should be the first port of call when it comes to the trade-offs amongst government priorities. Thanks.
好的，好，那个因为时间的关系哈，我想我们就简单做一下总结啊，因为这个其他的这个专家呀都回答的特别好，特别精彩。关于这个我们这个 CRM 这样的地球工程的技术对经济对政治有什么影响？我觉得其实还是要有大量的研究啊，比如说如果这个太阳辐射降低的话，会不会对我们的农作物啊就光合作用产生影响啊，甚至于会产生一些食物的短缺，对吧？或者呢，如果我们的这个光照减少的话，对我们的这个冰川啊，会这个它的融化会产生一定的影响，使得我们这个有一些依靠冰川水的流域会产生那么这种这个相关的水的缺乏等等，这些可能就是可能对我们的经济和社会产生的影响，甚至于有一些情况下，这些流域也是跨国境的啊，这样的话也可能会产生这个地缘政治上面的一些威胁，所以我觉得像这种方面的这个研究需要有大量的推进啊。刚才陈毅老师也说了，我们需要大量的投入，也是希望国际社会能够对这样的一个问题给予足够的重视。当然还有一个问题我这里就不再让大家回应了，就是说他们说有一个问题是，虽然我们对于这样的一个地球工程还有很多研究的差距，但是呢，我们能不能找到更好的解决气候变化的方法除了这个地球工程以外，那当然我们也期待有更多的研究以及提出更多的创新的方案，能为大家能够解决这种全球治理的问题。好，那么最后呢，也是非常感谢各位专家今天的精彩的发言和讨论，也感谢观众们的积极的参与和关注。气候变化问题是全球急需解决的重要的问题，只有通过多方的国际交流与合作，我们才能共同应对这一全球性的问题。最后呢，也是再次感谢大家的参与，我们也希望大家能够再次来推动，一起来共建我们的零碳社会。那这一期我们零碳智库的论坛也到此为止，谢谢大家。
好，谢谢。